Good evening and welcome. And thank you all for joining us for a very special evening and conversation. Before I introduce tonight's guest, Lynda Mapes, I want to make a few announcements and acknowledgments, and I'll start by offering a land acknowledgement. I am joining you all this evening from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people who have lived in the area where I live, Greater Seattle, since time immemorial, and who have stewarded and continue to steward their homelands today. We're all joining this conversation from different places. I think we all live and work in traditional Indigenous homelands and communities, and I will encourage you, if you are not already doing so, to take time to learn about them, their histories, their present cultures, and look for ways to support their efforts and activities on behalf of healthy waters, lands, climate, and communities. These are priorities and goals, of course, that benefit everybody. This is the second of 3 SOS webinars this fall, part of our 2025 Reciprocity series. Our series this fall features 3 thoughtful, provocative, and hopeful writers and thinkers. Tonight, we'll spend time with reporter and author Lynda Mapes. Last month, we had a wonderful discussion with professor and author Christopher Preston. And next month, November 20th, we'll spend an evening with former Washington State Poet Laureate Rena Priest. And we're honored to have you here with us tonight as well, and hope that you'll be able to join us next month too. And we certainly encourage you to share the webinar out with others who may be interested. We're also proud to co-host this webinar this evening with Washington Wild and Oregon Wild. Both are highly effective and well-respected organizations working to protect our region's wilderness, public lands and waters, wildlife and communities. So I want to welcome Lydia Cleveland from Washington Wild and Lauren Anderson from Oregon Wild to welcome you all and make a few quick comments.
Hey folks, my name is Lauren Anderson. I'm the Climate Forest Program Manager with Oregon Wild. I'm a big fan of protecting old growth forests. I'm based in our Portland office. Oregon Wild has been around for 50 years now, and we have offices in Portland, Eugene, Bend, and Enterprise. And I'll hand it over to Lydia.
Hi everyone, I'm Lydia Cleveland and I'm the Engagement and Volunteer Coordinator at Washington Wild. I'll be chatting with you after Lynda's presentation. I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren and Lydia, and we're honored to be partnering with you both in your organizations tonight. I also want to give a big shout out to the Natural Encounters Conservation Fund, who has generously sponsored this Reciprocity webinar series this year. And now I want to quickly review our program for the evening. In a moment, I'll introduce Lynda, and she'll talk about her new book, The Trees Are Speaking, Dispatches from the Salmon Forests. And after Lynda's presentation, she and I will chat for a couple of minutes, and then we'll open up the conversation with Q&A with you, our audience. And then finally, and importantly, we'll welcome back Lauren and Lydia to talk for a few minutes about the current conservation priorities concerning Northwest forests and public lands, and what we can all do to help defend them at this time. It is a great honor, to welcome our special guest, Lynda Mapes. If you live here in the Northwest, I feel like she really needs no introduction. She's an award-winning journalist and author. She's been writing in the region for most of her life. She's published, by my count, 7 books. I've read most of them, not all of them, and they're excellent. And they focus on our region's communities and environment. It's salmon, orca, rivers, and native and non-native communities and their many and special relationships and connections. I met Lynda over 25 years ago. She'll probably recall we used to share a commute at times, and back then I was sort of an inexperienced but passionate organizer, and I would occasionally, and I'm sure awkwardly, find some way to start a conversation with her, and that would inevitably lead to me suggesting some type of salmon story that I really thought she ought to pursue. I have since realized that I'm sure she saw me and my pitch coming long before I opened my mouth. But I will say that Lynda was always which she would always listen, might ask a question or two. And Lynda, you were always very gracious and accessible, and I thank you for that. Lots can be said about Lynda. You can read about her and her work at her website. I want to say this. Every place needs at least one Lynda, and very few have them. So here in the Northwest, we are blessed. Lynda is special and unique. Her writing and her reporting on our Northwest home, including, of course, about Native communities, has, in my opinion, been really transformational for our region and how we see ourselves, how we see each other, the stories we tell about the very special place we live in and share in common with other species like salmon, orcas, cedars, birds, rivers, and much more. Lynda's writing has been instrumental, I think, for helping define and understand who we are, where we are, and with whom we live. Though she recently retired from the Seattle Times, Lynda is staying active and continuing to write and think and share, and we're all the better for it. And so with that, I think, Lynda, I just want to welcome you and thank you so much for spending the evening with us tonight.
Thank you. What a very generous introduction. I really appreciate that. It's delightful to be here with you all. And on the topic of reciprocity, what a perfect tonic, what a perfect anecdote, what a lovely place to rest our minds and our hearts anytime, but especially now. Here we are going into autumn, going into winter. It's time to think about that beautiful gift that we've enjoyed all summer from nature, and how now nature is going to go into its time of rest, and we will go into our time of reflection and make our plans for next year. It's a perfect time to think about the gifts of nature, to think about the gifts of salmon in our forests, how they're all interrelated. And if you haven't been going out to see the forests right now, to see the trees in their regalia, now is the time. And very soon, you're going to be seeing coho in our local streams, even here in the city. Get yourself out there to Carkeek Park. Get yourself out there to the Green River. Look up these salmon season, SEESON events in our local streams, and go enjoy the miracle of the fact of these fish, that they come back to our local forests. You know, I'm sure all of you have traveled. You know what I'm saying when I say that when I come back here, no matter where I've been, I just feel an incredible gratitude and a sense of abundance and wealth. Here in the Northwest, it's not too late. We have so much already to enjoy and share. And my wish and my hope is that in our conversation tonight, we'll talk about how we can keep the best of what we have left, stop wrecking more, and fix that which needs fixing. This book, The Trees Are Speaking, is my latest. It's built on years of research in Northwest forests and in Northwest streams with Northwest tribes, with Northwest scientists. It was published by the University of Washington Press, which is a fine, independent university press that's been around for, believe it or not, more than a century, nonprofit, by the way. So I'm very proud of this work. The book took me by surprise. It's not the book I thought I was going to write, and I'm going to tell you about that this evening. I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you some slides of photos that I took during much of my field work. I wound up reporting it not only in the beautiful drip line of the old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest, but actually up in Canada, up in BC, and even over on the East Coast, because what I began to learn as I dug into this topic of salmon forests is this is a connected history. It's actually a history of loss of our salmon forests, not only here in the Pacific Northwest, but where it started in the East Coast with the Atlantic salmon and the forests there that the settlers, when they came and they saw coming wood famished from Europe, couldn't believe the wealth of the forests that cloaked our shores to the waterline, and began busily cutting, logging those forests, initially to send the biggest trees back to England, marked with the King's broad arrow for ships' masts for the Royal Navy. But eventually, of course, with the Revolution and the independence, fought in part with the Pine Tree War over those pine trees. Of course, then became all the rest of the story that we all know: settlement, colonization, and the beginning of the cutting of the primary forests of our country that sheltered the Atlantic salmon. And that cutting continued all the way across the country to the Pacific Northwest, where it's a very familiar story for all of us, and eventually cross the border into BC, where cutting of old growth forests, 1,000-year-old trees, is still going on. So this book is a little bit unusual. I haven't seen this story told that connects this history in quite this way. And I hope you enjoy it. So as I said, in some ways, this wasn't the book I expected to write. I really wanted to update the story of old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest. There hadn't been one since Ruth Kirk's very fine book done in the 1990s with Jerry Franklin, actually, the eminent forest ecologist, about the Hoh rainforest. And I thought, well, great, let's get into it. A lot has happened. Climate change, the passage of the Northwest Forest Plan, which protected old growth in Oregon, in Washington, in Northern California, 3 states, still the most ambitious preservation plan, multi-species preservation plan ever. And to update how that has worked out for salmon and for the spotted owl, to update so many things about our old growth forests. But as I got into it, I quickly found that actually what I wanted to talk about was not only these magnificent forests, but how we lost so much of them. But let's start with those magnificent forests. I hope that all of you listening tonight have been out to these places such as this. This is the Cedar Flats, the Natural Research Area. It is outside of Cougar, Washington, Southwest Washington. If you have not been, you must go. Jerry Franklin calls this the finest old growth forest in the lowland Cascades. It's where he took his students for decades to teach them about the special attributes of old growth forests. So this is Jerry and I in that forest talking about what is it that makes an old growth forest, what makes it a particular thing. We're not just talking about trees that are bigger or trees that are older. We're talking about a particular ecological assemblage that can only happen with one ingredient, and that is time. Because when you have an enormous amount of time and the trees are allowed to unspool their own stories over that long time, uninterrupted by us, this is what you get. An assemblage of species, number one, such as these juicy mushrooms, a perfect understory that is full of all of the native plants, a complete botanical library of the native plants. Not only that, but the trees themselves just plain look different. They look different for the same reason we do at great age. All of the things that have happened to them, the lightning strikes, the windstorms, the ice storms, and time itself gradually change the bark, and so it's broken into streamers and plates. You get these great caved in holes at the trunk and all kinds of places where wildlife hide. And I think the other thing that struck me was the beauty of the small things, not just the big things, but the small things. To watch a lens of rain slowly take on that mirrored look after a spring shower. One of the other things that's so important about an old growth forest that sets it apart is diversity. Diversity of species, yes, but also spatial diversity. Take a look at this picture. This is an old growth forest. This is the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest in Oregon. What do you see? Not only big trees, but also gaps, sunny places. An old growth forest is not a dank, dark grove. It's actually full of sunlight, where the old trees have been able to finally fall down and leave space for this, the new life that comes, such as these ferns, the tiny little things that need those open areas and those gaps. The other thing that's true about an old growth forest that's been able to grow into its own long ecological song is the diversity of species. Notice all the deciduous trees along with the conifers. The thing that sets our old growth forests apart here on the western side of the Cascades, these are the moist hemlock forests. It is a combination of the climate, mild in winter, mild in summer, never very hot, not super cold, all the moisture that we get, of course. And so you get this kind of terrarium effect. And secondly, it's the species themselves. Only here do we have the Sitka spruce, the Douglas fir, these trees that are capable of growing to enormous size, skyscraper trees. Not only that, but we get trees that are capable of persisting to great age. Douglas fir is only beginning to reach old growth characteristics in its 2nd century. Until then, it is still just a growing young start. It doesn't even begin to look like an old growth tree. Take on those special attributes that we talked about of great age, the broken tops, the candelabra tops, the streaming bark, this vast fluted trunk. That doesn't even begin to start until its 2nd century. And then we have trees such as these cedars that you see here too. They can persist to 1,000 years, even older. So it's the climate, it's the species themselves, it's the diversity of species, and it's the spatial diversity, gaps, sunlight, as well as very large trees. I think when you put it all together, there's one more very special quality I want to talk about, and that is the light. When you go into an old growth forest, the light itself is green. And there's the fragrance of the forest, the fragrance of soils that have been made over centuries. One of the first things I do when I lie down in a forest is take a nap. And so, you know, talking with Jerry about these forests and what is so special about them and why they are so unique, they are special for climate, because this is where most of the climate protection comes from in our forests. We're often told, no, it's the thrifty, young, fast-growing stands, and that's just not true. It's been proven many times in scientific papers, and it just makes common sense, doesn't it, that it wouldn't be that small, fast-growing tree. It would be this massive tree with so much surface area that is sucking away the most carbon, not only as a living tree, but even as a burned tree, it'll still be a standing snag, and even as a fallen tree. This Douglas fir will take hundreds of years to decompose. And all of that time, its carbon is locked up in those tissues of its leaves, its branches, its bark, its wood, its roots, and in the soil itself. And so this is the mother lode, these big trees, these old growth forests. So they're very important for carbon. They're incredibly important for wildlife. There's so many species that only live in an old growth, some of them only in the canopy. They never come down in their entire life. And then they're very important for us. These places are, you know, incredibly important places for human well-being and solace. And so as I listened to Jerry and I took notes and I thought about all that I wanted to do with this book and all that I wanted to bring forward about these old growth forests and why they are so special, things that Jerry Franklin and his collaborators at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest brought forward for us in their work beginning in the 1980s. So this is very recent work. You know, what became clear also in listening to him is that there was another story to tell, which was the tragedy really of how we lost so much of it. And this is the story of industrial forestry and how what you really get in a place like this that we went to go see next after that forest, what you're really looking at here is not forestry, it's farming. You know, you've converted a natural diverse forest to a crop. And you're basically going to turn that crop over as fast as you can for the most profit you can make for distant investors. This is no longer a forest, it is a farm, and it's being managed for one value only, and that's return on capital. And this is profit making off of nature. This is financialization of nature. And when you manage anything for only one value, it will not be a balanced outcome. And certainly when you look at this landscape, you can see that this land is not being asked to do anything for anything other than profit. There's not much here for wildlife. There's nothing here for carbon storage. It's not any good for water conservation. It doesn't clean the air, and it certainly doesn't feel good to be there. And so as I confronted this and thought about what I wanted to do with this book, I felt like what I really needed to do was talk about not just the fact that we've lost a lot of forest land in Washington state, but make the point that this is still going on. The cutting of the old growth forests that take care of our salmon is still going on in BC, right across the border. You know, we protected 24 million acres of forest land in the 3 states of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California with the Northwest Forest Plan, but right across the border in the very same place in terms of what the salmon would tell you, or what the spotted owl would tell you, or for that matter, what the orcas would tell you, right across the border, same biodiversity needs. We're doing this. You know, we see these logs being cut that are from trees that are 1,000 years old. And it's not just in one place. It's happening all over Vancouver Island. And I went up there with Suzanne Samard, the eminent biologist who's taught us about the interconnection between these trees, even below ground, and spent a week with her research crew, really looking at this landscape and asking and answering the question, what happens, for instance, to the soil, which is what we're studying in this picture, when you take away the forest that was there for 1,000 years? And if you want to try to bring these forests back, what would you need to do for the soil so that it could support life as it did once again? We spent a lot of time talking about how these forests, where they still exist in the lowland bottomlands on Vancouver Island, of the rivers and of the streams, these unprotected white rhino forests, as they're called because they are so rare, what they mean for salmon. This statement that I make in my book, I call this book "The Trees Are Speaking: Dispatches from the Salmon Forest." That's not a metaphor. That's not just a woo-woo thing. This is a scientific thing and a real thing. And the first people of BC and the first people of this place and elsewhere can tell you that, and the scientists will tell you that. Teresa Ryan, pictured here, is both a Tsimshian Nation person and a biologist, and her expertise is in the connections between the salmon and the forests. I talked with her at length about how, in her culture, these forests and these salmon were managed for abundance. And they were managed together for abundance, because if you have the big trees and you have the forests, they hold the soil, they shade the stream, they keep it cool. And when you do that, you get salmon that come back in abundance. And when you get salmon that have been managed for abundance, that in turn feeds the trees. I actually mean that literally. I talked with scientists in BC who said when you have a really big run of fish in the forest in, say, the Adams River, you can see it from space. There have been so many salmon coming back that their carcasses, which are dragged into the forest by wildlife, feed the soil itself, and the trees are greener. The canopy is greener, and you can see it in satellite imagery from space. You can also see the salmon in the trees inside their wood. I've talked with scientists who, when they pull out cores from these trees to measure their age, they can see the really big fat rings correspond to the years of the big salmon runs. Those are the big growth years, because the soil is being fed and so are the trees with this nitrogen and this phosphorus that's in the bodies of the salmon that have left these streams as just fingerlings about that big. And they go out to the great pastures of the sea, where they gain all of their body size, 2 years, 4 years, even 5 years. They'll come back to the very place where they were born. And when they do, it is wildlife that mediate this beautiful exchange between the land and the sea, between the forests and the salmon, the bears, the cougars, the mink, all the little varmints that come and drag those carcasses into the forest. And then that nutrition goes into the soil. And it even makes its way through the mycorrhizal fungi, much further from the streams than we ever knew. And so this intimacy between the forest and the fish, between the salmon and the trees, is chemical and physical and biological. And it can be eternal. If we do not mess with this cycle, with dams, with logging, it can go on forever. Teresa spoke beautifully and eloquently, I thought, about the ethic in her community of managing for abundance, and talking with Ernest Alfred from the Namvis First Nation, and going into the big house and talking with elders there about how they manage for salmon and manage for forests and manage for the next generation and the one after that and the one after that. This is about abundance and cycles of renewal that can go on forever. Managing not for commodification, not for financialization, not for profit in a distant bank, but for living wealth kept in the forest. And that when you do that, you measure your wealth not in some distant bank or profit, but with the ability to put on a feast. And the more people you can invite, the more food you can give away from your territory, the richer you are. You are the Tyee. What a beautiful idea. And what joy I encountered being with these people, sharing their food, sharing their culture. And what bravery, by the way. I mean, this is an elder from the Montaguila First Nation who undertook to do a one-woman land back on the east side of Vancouver Island, to just take herself to her traditional territory. And with the help of some students at UBC who floated a cabin out there for her to take residence in, just set up a one-woman land back in the woods, back where her people used to be. And you see the happiness in her face of being back where she belongs. The trees themselves have stood up for the first people of British Columbia. These trees are on Nootka Island, and the Nuchatlat people of Nootka Island actually went to court, to the Supreme Court of British Columbia, to sue, to regain their right and title to these forests, to these lands. Why? Not because they want to log them and sell the trees, but because they want to establish salmon parks to end the practice of industrial logging on their lands so that they can manage them once more for salmon. It's a 1,000-year vision to let these rivers, streams, and forests and fish recover together under the grace of nature. And to make their case in court against BC, which was telling them, oh no, I mean, when we came in 1790 and Captain George Vancouver docked and looked around, there was nobody there. There was nobody in the forest. They weren't using these places. To which they entered testimony by anthropologists of trees like this that have been bark scarred. Those scars are hundreds of years old, 500 years, 600 years, 400 years. And those scars were made by native people stripping bark from the trees to use for all kinds of household uses, anything from clothing to even baby diapers. And so the trees themselves spoke up for the Nuchatlat people in court. And you know what? They won. They won back the right and title to the lands along the shore of Nuchatlat's territory on Nootka Island, and they're going back for more. Now let's talk about Maine. That's where this picture was taken. It's actually just a frame from a video that I made driving for miles along this clear cut. We need to reckon with the fact that industrial forestry has been the way of forestry in the United States for a very long time. It started back in the day with hand logging, and it progressed quickly to industrialized forestry, beginning in Maine, which was the birthplace of industrial forestry in our country. By 1860, before Washington was even a state, Bangor was the site of the largest sawmill and the biggest sawmill industry anywhere in the nation. And you know, the logging is different in Maine, and in several ways the species are different, and they also get their moisture across the year evenly, unlike us. And so they call it the magic forest. You cut it and it comes back. It's kind of like gardening. But honestly, it's not that magical. You get up in the air in a plane, as I did, to go look at it, because you can only see things at this scale from the air. And when you talk about the 10 million acres of private forest land in northern Maine, this is what it looks like. This is called strip cutting. And sadly, it's a response to clear cutting and a citizen initiative to end it. Ultimately, those clear cuts that outraged the citizens were the size of townships. Think about how big that is. And the response was this, strip cutting, which actually is worse. You're taking about the same amount of material, but you're creating much more edge, and much more disturbance, which is terrible for wildlife. And, you know, why was that happening? Look how small the trees are, by the way. None of the things you see in this pile are any bigger than a coffee can. This is logging reduced to what is called clip, chip, and ship. So you're using a single mechanized harvester to basically clip off the bottom of a small tree, chip it on site, blow it into the back of a truck, take it to port, and send it overseas to China to be made into usually Amazon boxes. So the history of this ever smaller and smaller tree logging begins with the pulp mills. So the pulp industry in Maine back in the day was the largest in the country. And of course, it's all gone offshore now where it's cheaper and less environmental regulation. But very sadly, you know, what you're left in on the Penobscot River, the second largest in Maine and an important salmon river, is this, basically a rust belt of dead pulp mills from the Canadian border to the head of tide. Now, this is impossible for the towns that are left with this wreckage. You know, what are they supposed to do? These mills have all declared bankruptcy. They're leaking dioxins into the river that still have not dissipated. you're left with a situation where you really have to ask yourself, what are these towns supposed to do now? But honestly, if you were to go to Aberdeen, if you were to go to Forks, if you were to go to Cosmopolis, we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about places that were basically stripped of natural resources, and the people were just left to pick up the pieces. And I didn't want this book to be only about gloom and doom. I also wanted to talk about solutions. So how do we do this differently? We know these forests are precious. We know we need them for salmon, and that's just as true in the East Coast as here in the Pacific Northwest. And so I went to go see people at the Penobscot tribe, and I asked them to show me their forest lands. How do they do forestry? Which they do for the same reason everybody else does, for jobs, for money, for the materials that they need. But take a look at this picture. This is what it looked like. So this is forestry done with a much lighter touch, much more selective, leaving larger trees to grow bigger. Very importantly, working to be lighter on the land. Notice the water. They use temporary bridges there instead of just, massive culverts and logging roads to try again to go easier on the land. The thing that really struck me when I was out there was how much wildlife we saw. All kinds of moose, turkey, birds, and it was February, typically a very quiet time in the woods. I thought, okay, that's fine. This is small tribe, small scale stuff. Let's go talk to some commercial loggers, people doing this for a living. So, what do you do when you're a stranger in a strange land? You go to the university and you ask around. And I talked to people at the University of Maine in Orono and said, I need to know how you do commercial logging in Maine. I want to meet some people. And they said, oh, Molly, you need to talk to Molly. She's the logger of the year. And I thought, okay, Molly's getting a call. And to her infinite credit, Molly London, who you see pictured here, allowed me to come out with her and her crew and spend some time with them in the woods and see how they do what they do. That's Molly with her newest baby and her husband out in the woods on the job they were doing for one of the largest landowners actually in Maine. And this is in Down East Maine off the Stud Mill Road. And what was interesting was going in the cab, squeezing on the single seat with one of her crew. And we spent the day watching, as he did that work together. And what I learned from him was two things. Number one, this is very sophisticated, difficult work now, working with equipment that's specially made to do what they call restoration forestry, where basically they're trying to take the smallest stuff and leave the big stuff to get bigger for higher value products. And the thing that blew me away was who's their client? It's the Appalachian Mountain Club, the same people who are behind some of this fish restoration work. And it all fits together. Because on the Penobscot River, they're doing dam removal, just like we've done on the Elwha, just like was just done on the Klamath. And the Appalachian Mountain Club is working very hard on what they call their Maine Woods Initiative, in which they are acquiring land and doing three things with it. One, restoration forestry, such as we talked about. Two, recreational use, which is their specialty. But number three, wilderness preservation. And a big piece of what they're trying to do is fish passage. Now, this is northern Maine, so we're talking lands far away from the sea where people had kind of forgotten all about sea-run fish, whether they were herring or they are or Pacific salmon. But the beautiful news is that between dam removal and all this work of taking out old culverts and improving fish passage, these sea-run fish are coming back to places like this, the Penobscot River, where they've taken out the VZ Dam. And, to me, this is so hopeful. You go to a place like this, the Penobscot River, where there was a dam not 10 years ago, and today it looks like this. Does that sound like the Elwha? Does that sound like the Klamath? It's the same story, where salmon people of all types are coming together to try to restore these lands and these waters, do forestry better, and take care of this place so it can come back to life. Atlantic salmon. Who knew, right? We're not familiar with them, but here's a nice big one in a piece of fish passage equipment that was put in at the Penobscot River. It's a kind of an elevator thing where the fish gets put in this device and it's lifted over the dam to continue its journey. I went out with some scientists from the Sea Grant NGO to go see, well, how's it going? And they've been surveying the Penobscot River every year for 10 years to check the level of biodiversity. And, going out with them was so inspiring. Herring are starting to come back to this river by the millions, that's an M. And when you get that much biomass coming back, it feeds the land. Even salmon are coming back. Now, to us, a run of 1,000 fish sounds pretty measly, tiny, 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 and it is small. But for one thing, salmon never came back in the same numbers back east as they do here. Salmon there are really a suite, part of a suite of sea-run fish, 11 different species, including herring. But to get 1,000 fish back in a river that was so polluted 12 years ago, 15 years ago, that it was turning colors, is a remarkable achievement. And so I think that for me, though, this was my very favorite discovery in Maine. They're doing culvert work too, just like us, and for the very same reason, to bring back sea-run fish in a place where they had been all but forgotten about. And they're using local people to do the work with field engineering skills that they learned building logging roads. People like, as a matter of fact, Molly London's father-in-law. We went out to look at some of the bridges that he has built and built to replace old culverts that he'd put in back when he built the original logging roads, so that these sea-run fish can come back, and places like Silver Lake suddenly have a whole new meaning that they haven't had in 100 years. And he is so proud of every single one of these that he signs them with welding bead. I found that very hopeful. And with that, I will leave you to begin our discussion, take your questions, and reflect on salmon forests together.
Lynda, thanks so much. I read your book a few months ago, and just listening brought back a lot of memories and questions. One of the things that jumped out at me when I read your book was your description of an indigenous, and you talked a little bit about it tonight, the indigenous natural resource management methodologies, right? And your book provides some very specific examples from my perspective that I had, sort of heard about, but not seen, sort of dealt with in detail, including the sort of values, goals, types of actions, and how decisions get made, which were all different than the way we're used to it in my experience in the U.S. I found it very insightful and opened up my thinking about how we can think together, work together, and do better in that regard, which by any metric we need to. I just want to ask that question of you of, can you talk a little bit more about sort of your exposure to, thoughts on these kinds of stewardship management systems that you encountered, whether as part of this book or in other contexts too?
Sure. So to me, this really came down to a piercingly beautiful idea. And here we are having a webinar series on reciprocity. That is the core idea. And so you basically have a management and acknowledgement system based on the concept that people are just part of a web of life, and we're not above it, and we're not in charge of it. In fact, we're the vulnerable ones. We're the ones that need the help of all these non-human beings to feed us, clothe us, take care of us, inspire us, guide us. And, if you think about yourself as part of a larger web of beings, in fact, a vast intelligence that you need to survive, you manage it differently. You don't just like go in there and take it all down and take it away, assuming that, planting a row of trees is just going to be the same thing. You act humbly, and you're instructed by the place itself, and you're instructed by the beings that live there, recognizing that we live amid a vast intelligence that we could learn from. And so it's an ethic of respect and reciprocity, as opposed to commodification and financialization for short-term gain. And it's an interesting thing, because if you think about it that way, people aren't the problem, which is hopeful. It's how we behave that's the problem. And we can change that. And in fact, we have over time, that's fungible. That can go up or down, be better and worse. And so this idea that we're like frozen in this behavior that we're just doomed to repeat until we basically blow ourselves up actually doesn't have to be that way. And there are other cultures on our earth that don't live that way. So there's a lot to learn from one another. Fortunately, the first people of our country, incredibly, not only are still here, but are still talking to us. So, these collaborations, look, we're all here now together, and we need to make this work. We need to heal the earth, and we need to heal how we live here. It's not only about respect and reciprocity. It's about taking less, using less. Nobody wants to talk about consumption. But, there was a time as recently as the 1970s when people talked about this a lot. Small is beautiful. There was a population clock in Times Square. Now we're talking about giving people tax credits to have more and more kids. So it swung all the way the other way to a glorification of consumption and commodification and, more, bigger everything. And the earth can't do that. But I do want to point out that not everybody, even today, lives that way. We live amid many societies that do not live that way or think that way. And secondly, we didn't even do that. Rather recently, we had a president in the White House with solar panels on the roof turning down the thermostat. So it's not too late, it's not over, and it's changeable.
Thanks, Lynda. I think a lot about the sort of false silos. I think this is building on or expanding some of what you've been talking about, at least implicitly, the false silos that have been constructed that are part of our culture, and how these silos are in strong contrast, in my opinion, to indigenous cultures with which I am familiar. The silos pretend that various aspects of our life are separate from each other. Environment's here, education's here, healthcare's here, economy somewhere else, and there's probably some stacking and prioritization of those things that sort of delivered to us: water, climate, technology, and then relevant to this conversation, the silos of salmon and forests and rivers and energy and so forth. In the Columbia Basin, salmon or energy are further pitted against each other. Bonneville and the utilities will tell us, you can have one or the other. You can't have both, which of course is false. And that kind of thinking, which I think is endemic in our culture, is a big problem that encourages both simplistic thinking and then ineffective solutions, because they're simple, non-integrated solutions. And most of our problems, life is linked, right? The real world, everything's linked and integrated. And so solutions to problems have to be linked and integrated too. I feel like in the Northwest, in the space I work in, salmon and the Columbia Basin, we've made some progress in this regard recently, and it's in many respects due to the leadership and vision and participation of the tribes. Having said that, I'm sort of interested in your reflections on this idea of silos and the integration and its significance as we think about how we move forward.
It's a great observation and really stimulating to think about for me, but also really hopeful to think about, because I have a friend at Nez Perce. Her name is Angela Jackson, and she says it very simply. She says, if you take care of the salmon, you take care of everything else.
Right.
You take care of the water, you take care of the water quality, you take care of the water temperature, you take care of the forests that take care of the water, you take care of the people, you take care of the animals. So that's a pretty good list. Kind of everything, right? So instead of thinking that, we'll do energy over here and we'll do fish stuff over here and forests, that's yet another thing. It obviously has gotten us where we are. And it's also put us as a community where we are, with people pitted against each other and working at cross purposes. So, when I think about the Northwest, and I'm not from here, so maybe to me it's just super clear in the way it sometimes is to an outsider, salmon are the uniter. They are the silver thread that connects the east side of the state to the west, the fresh water to the salt, the mountains to the sea. And they connect all of us too. There's farmers over there in the Palouse, they're connected to the fishers out there on the coast and the orca waiting to eat the salmon. So, her simple expression, if you take care of the salmon, you take care of everything else. She's absolutely right about that. And I guess I would expect that from people whose culture is the oldest documented culture anywhere in North America.
Yeah. Thanks. I've thought about the great wisdom of centering salmon as your totem species in many respects, which is what so many tribal communities have because of the implications that you just described. They connect to everything, and their future and health connects to the future and health of everything else. I'm gonna thank you. I want to open things up and ask a few questions that come from some of the people that are in attendance. I'm going to start with one that's sort of specific to Washington State, and one I know that you've reported on and thought a lot about. The question is, what do you think about how Washington State Department of Natural Resources is managing its legacy forests?
Oh, brother, I knew this would come up. I'll say a couple things about this. Number one, this is a brand new issue, and I really hand it to the citizens who created it. I mean, nobody was talking about legacy forests 5 years ago. It didn't exist as a term. And this really started, there's a core over here on the shelf in my study from a giant old growth tree on DNR land that their people had missed, just, honest mistake when they were out cruising a sale that was about to happen. And this wonderfully nerdy, sort of irritating guy named Stephen Kropp, who likes to go out and look at DNR prospective sales for a hobby. He's really good with mapping. He's great out in the bush. He's just looking at this particular sale and he thought, missed a spot, because in Washington, old growth is protected on state land too. That's anything that sprouted before 1850. And so he called me and I said, okay, yeah, let's go look at it and let's take some people from DNR too. And to their credit, they resampled it and recognized their mistake and they pulled the sale, canceled it, clawed it back. Very unusual when something's already been sold. That kind of got it all started for the Legacy Forest Defense Coalition. They started leading forest walks for citizens to go out and see these forests that were on the block, state forests. And they created a website with just a fantastic gallery of photos of trees that were about to be sold, to be cut. People had no idea. They had no idea the beauty, the diversity, the age of some of these forests that DNR was putting up for sale. Now, it's not old growth, but these are the sloppy hand cuts from the early 1900s, regrown to what will be the old growth of tomorrow if you leave it alone. So, I think in a state that's growing as fast as ours, where you have a lot of counties that today are not relying on natural resources for their coffers, and that now includes places like Jefferson County and even Clallam County, places that maybe 20 years ago saw it differently. It wasn't just the hair on fire activists who were taking it to DNR about these forests. It was these counties. You had rural county commissioners suddenly writing into DNR from Skagit County saying, leave it, because actually the trees are more important to us. And you had the superintendent of public instruction saying, look, the amount of money you're giving me for school construction doesn't matter. But sadly, in Washington, we still base our funding for rural social services and rural community services on cutting of trees. And in a place like, oh gosh, many of the sort of West End communities, they're really relying on that. West End meaning like Forks and other places. They're relying on that money hookworm to buy a new police cruiser. Well, that in the year 2025, you got to ask yourself, does that really make sense in a time of climate emergency and biodiversity emergency? It seems to me the question is much more fundamental. Again, I'm not from here, so it's like Washington, you don't have an income tax. Why are you relying on your remaining forests to take care of communities that need libraries and police cruisers and basic services? So this is a question Washington's got to confront, and DNR is right in the middle of it. We just had an election, brought in Dave Up the Grove on the promise of not cutting any more of these, mature older forests until taking a look at that and rethinking the policy. And, to his credit, he did that. He hit the brakes day one when he was elected. And he did cancel a bunch of sales after he lifted the pause. Not as many as some of the activists wanted. None of the ones that Hillary Franz, his predecessor, had pushed through at the end. And I've seen some of those forests, and boy, they really deserved some of them a serious rethink. This is not finished work. DNR has, and not only DNR, but the legislature and the people of Washington has got to take a look at this question more holistically in terms of, all right, if you don't want to cut these forests, number one, how about the money? How's that going to happen? What are you going to do about that? Because these communities need what they need. And number two, how much should be set aside and where is it? And what's fair game? We need wood products, and we use a lot of them more than ever. I would say this, if anyone's super worried about the timber supply in Washington, one thing you could stop doing is shipping it overseas. I mean, on private lands, when you cut trees, those things wind up on a dock in Port Angeles and elsewhere, going to China and everywhere else to become cement forms. So to me, this is the beginning of a conversation that is not at all worked out yet. And it's going to take the legislature answering hard questions and citizens pushing them to answer them to set the policy for DNR. Because unless you take care of the money, you can't take care of the trees.
Lynda, you've planted a seed that anticipates my next question, and it's reflected from a few different people. You're talking about the policies that clearly don't make sense, aren't working, and need to change. And there's a number of questions from people that are asking for your campaign guidance. And I'll give a couple of specific examples. My question is, how can we lead people to care and act when they have no experience with ancient forests, but lots of contact with Amazon boxes? Reading your book would be a great start. Do you have other suggestions? And before you answer that, I want to just sort of add another question from Rachel. How do we get the public, legislatures, and DNR agencies to grasp how critically urgent and existential it is to leave the 80-plus-year-old trees and forests intact, starting now, to provide water, carbon storage, biodiversity, on which we all depend? Themes of your book. So it's the question of education and mobilization in our democracy, and any thoughts or advice for folks on that?
Yes, absolutely. I used to cover the Washington State Legislature, and before that, the Maryland General Assembly, and I've covered a lot of campaigns. And I can tell you something that might surprise you. Your voice is amazingly important, and it is heard. So I can give you an example. I remember once I was on the floor of the Washington State Legislature, and this big fight over an appointment of a Fish and Wildlife Commissioner, and ultimately it was put on hold, it was canceled. It was like, we'll come back to that. My constituents are just so angry, we got to table this. And I was like, wow, I wonder what happened. And I went up to that lawmaker and I said, how many people did you hear from? And he said, 8. I thought, ow, is that all it takes? I mean, honestly, in this world, how rare is it that you get, Joseph, an actual envelope with a stamp, with something somebody wrote you, a person, an actual human being? You're like, oh my God, somebody must have died. I mean, we're in this culture of bits and bytes, and to actually show up in person, I said in person, at a public hearing, and speak words you wrote about something that you actually went to go see yourself and can talk about, that's powerful. And you'd be shocked at how few people do it. And you know what happens then? It's all given over to the interest groups and the robo postcard campaigns and the stuff that nobody pays any attention to, because it's all just blah, blah, blah. But if you actually sit down and write a real letter yourself and put a stamp on it and send it to Patty Murray, Maria Cantwell, your Washington State delegation, somebody's going to read that thing. And you know why I know that? Because I used to be that person. I used to work for a congressman. It was my job to open the mail. So, your voice actually matters. And if you use it in a personal way, in a respectful way, and an informed way, you will be heard. And it's even better if you get together with your neighbors and other people. These forest walks that the Legacy Forest Defense Coalition has been doing, the work that so many NGOs are doing on behalf of salmon, on behalf of forests. Nobody can do this stuff alone, but it's very important that each of us do it individually and personally and from an informed perspective. And honestly, it's about showing up. And in this way, it's no different than anything else in life. Do the work and show up and then go back again. People want some magic bullet, and it isn't magic. It's the usual business of doing the thing and then doing it again.
Thanks, Linda. I think you talked about this earlier, but I'll just emphasize, in addition to reading your book, getting outside, you talked about, someone asked about the forest in that Jerry Franklin brought his
Oh, yeah.
students. What was the name of that?
That's the Cedar Flats Research Natural Area. Hard to
Okay.
remember because it's sort of awkward. It's Forest Service land. These exist all over the country, these research natural areas, and this one's outside of Cougar. So that's the nearest state,
Cougar,
Cougar,
Washington.
Washington. And it's a tiny, sweet little town down in the southwest corner of the state. Most of us don't go there very often because there's very little public land, very little. But here's what I love about this trail. You can drive to the trailhead and it's flat and it's soft. Anybody can do this. You can take any elder in your household, any kid, and you should. It's any time of year, because again, lowland Cascades, it's not going to be cold, it's not going to be hot. It will change your life. If you haven't seen this stuff, you need to go get it. You can do it in a weekend and you should. It's and then while you're driving around, go look at some of those private industrial clear cuts that are 5 miles away, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about and why it matters.
Thanks, Linda. I'll acknowledge there are probably more than a few folks from outside of Washington State, so it doesn't work for everyone, but they should find their local areas.
Yeah.
And I will just emphasize there's no substitute for the direct engagement, the being out in the world and developing those direct relationships and awareness yourself. And that leads to then action over time in a way that I think is hard to make happen without it. Donald asked a question about sort of a more of a science ecology question. He says, you mentioned that it's been found salmon nutrients travel farther from streams than anyone imagined. Can you just talk a little bit more about that, and particularly what kind of distances do the nutrients travel?
Well, specifically, this we do not know. This is an area of active research that Teresa and Suzanne Simard are doing in their lab. And it's not easy, by the way, because you're trying to trace the molecular movement of nutrients in the ground, right? In roots. So not easy work, but that is the work they're doing. And the investigation is to understand through the presence of the mycorrhizal fungi, which connect tree to tree, root to root, and trees benefit from these connections because it vastly expands the surface area that their roots have with these fungal threads all throughout the soil that are bringing in water and minerals to the tree. And in exchange, the fungus, which of course gets no sun, gets carbohydrates, sugars from the tree. So it's a beautiful mutualistic relationship. And the investigation is to look at the movement of these nutrients that are also in the soil from the carcasses of salmon through these networks. How far does that go? So, I like to think of it as this kind of mysterious goodness that's moving in the soil brought by the fish from the sea, and the interconnection of it being mediated by wildlife. That's a beautiful world to think about, all those connections. And we know a lot about it at this point. We know in Washington alone, there are 115 species of wildlife that benefit directly from salmon. So that means they're directly feeding on the carcasses or the bugs that eat the carcasses. So that could be a bird, it could be a bear, it could be a cougar, it could be even a caterpillar. But then there are all these indirect relationships, such as this nutrition. And what does that mean if you don't have salmon? This is something I'm thinking about a lot right now because I'm going to be speaking next week about the loss of big fish in the Columbia. These 80-pound Chinook that used to just lumber up the Columbia to the upper Columbia and cross all the way into Canada. They called them the June hogs. What does it mean when you don't have that anymore? Well, there was a scientist named Jan Olberger who used to be at the UW, now he's at WDFW, and he had the really smart idea of looking at old cannery records to try to understand what was the biomass being taken out of the Columbia system by fishing at that scale back in the day. And then working the math about, fish back then were a certain size, and we know this because of the cannery records, and what would be the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the carcass of those animals if you totaled it all up, coming back every year to the Columbia Basin. And it's so much tonnage of nitrogen and phosphorus, these basic nutrients that our forests are depauperate of, coming back every year, feeding the streams and the land and the forests. And so if you think about salmon this way, they're basically swimming sacks of free fertilizer. And if you take that out of the system, you're starving the land. Of course, the animals and the people too. But I think a lot of people forget about that ingredient of the picture of the salmon coming back and feeding the trees and feeding the land itself. And it's both a beautiful thing to think about and a necessary thing to think about. They're not optional, nice to have creatures. They're keystone species that make it all work here. And they always have.
One of the attendees, John, added that surveys on the Haida Gwaii, north of here in BC, recorded dispersals of salmon carcasses by black bears an average distance of half a kilometer. So
wow.
big dispersal across the landscape. I want to invite Lydia and Lauren back on. I'll just acknowledge Lydia and Lauren that you've seen them too. There's been a number of questions about the politics at the federal level and how we can that we didn't get to answer. And that I think that provides a nice segue for the things you're going to be talking about and help address that need and provide maybe an opportunity for people to help out.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I didn't realize how much I needed a hopeful message, and that was just wonderful to hear. So Lydia and I are going to talk about a few threats to our public lands right now, including the rescission of the roadless rule, which is probably one of the biggest threats facing our public lands. We're going to go over some ways for folks to get involved. Real quick, though, to introduce Oregon Wild to you all, I know we have a lot of folks who aren't from Oregon on here. Oregon Wild is one of America's oldest state-based public lands and wildlife conservation organizations. For the last 50 years, we've worked to protect our wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for future generations. Today, our work is focused on defending public lands, which is a big one. We're also very focused on protecting mature and old growth forests as a natural climate solution, which ties into the points that Lynda made. And we're also focused right now on passing a new 1% for Wildlife bill to fund our state wildlife agencies, which is very exciting. Our staff is spread out across the state in 4 regional offices, and we rely on the strength of our active grassroots network of Oregon Wild members, activists, and volunteers. And we advocate for Oregon's unique landscapes through a unique combination of public lands education, communication strategies, direct lobbying, grassroots activism, and partnering with and elevating key allied groups and voices, like on this webinar. And I'll hand it over to Lydia to introduce herself and Washington Wild.
Hi, everyone. Once again, I'm Lydia, and I'm the Engagement and Volunteer Coordinator at Washington Wild. So for the past 46 years, Washington Wild has been working to protect the public lands and waters that make this state so special. And we do that by bringing people together, which is elected officials, local businesses, tribes, and community members, all united by a shared love for these places. Every year, we coordinate about a dozen sign-on letters that bring together anywhere from 20 to 300 different groups and voices. And these letters help protect what we have left of Washington's old growth forest, support efforts like the Wild Olympics campaign, defend the roadless rule, and push back on any attempts to sell off our national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges. We are much smaller than Oregon Wild. We have 6 staff members, so we really heavily rely on the grassroots activism and our coalitions.
Thanks, Lydia. Small but mighty. So these days, I like to preface my presentations by acknowledging that these are scary times, and it's getting really hard to keep track of all the bad stuff that's been happening. So we're going to go over a few threats public lands are facing, including the roadless rule threats. But the goal of this presentation is to empower you all and educate you all about these threats and provide some ways to get engaged, not to depress you all. So quick reminder as we go through all of this, it's okay if you're not able to keep track of everything. Forests and public lands are facing a lot these days. You also don't need to be an expert to be engaged and to make a difference on these issues. Educating yourself through webinars like this one and taking small actions to defend public lands makes a really big difference. Like Lynda said, your voice still matters a lot with decision makers. Don't forget in the theme of reciprocities, to build your community and find joy in the resistance, because this is a marathon, not a sprint, and you really do need that community. I highly recommend reading Lynda's book. Get outdoors, go on a hike with your friends, enjoy nature, and then write your members of Congress. All right, let's get into it. All right, so this administration issued 2 executive orders. They aim to frame logging as the primary purpose of federal forest land management, which we know is not true. Wildlife and water and salmon are incredibly important as well. It frames increasing timber production as a matter of national and economic security, and it aims to reverse any federal policies that have prevented the ability to fully exploit our domestic timber supply. So the only good thing that can be said about this executive order is that it is not trying to be sneaky. It is very clear in its goal of trying to profit off of nature and public lands and turn those beautiful natural forests that we saw into tree farms. So following on these executive orders, USDA Secretary Rollins, who oversees the U.S. Forest Service, and Forest Service is within USDA, declared an emergency situation determination across 113 million acres of our national forests, which will enable the agency to fast-track logging projects. In summary, this administration is clearly prioritizing industrial logging over the other uses and values of our public lands, and manufacturing a national security crisis to justify this. It directs federal agencies to find ways to weaken key environmental protections like the National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, our bedrock environmental laws. And again, it's very focused on profit and maximizing timber production. The next thing I'm going to discuss is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is one of our most important environmental laws. Whoever wrote NEPA really dropped the ball on the marketing and branding strategy. However, when you think of our bedrock environmental laws like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, it's pretty clear why those laws are incredibly important. NEPA is the people's environmental law. It's the guarantee that Americans will get accurate information about a project's impacts, a choice of sound stewardship alternatives, and the right to have your voice heard before the government makes a final decision on projects. It ensures transparency, balance, common sense, and openness in federal decision-making. This summer, USDA, which again oversees U.S. Forest Service and our National Forest System, and Department of Interior, which oversees purifying management lands, issued new NEPA regulations that essentially are designed to exclude the public from decision-making on public lands, which is a big problem. So into the context of what we're seeing of this administration's priorities of timber production and the lack of transparency around public lands decision-making, enter the rescission of the roadless rule. So it's one of the biggest threats facing our public lands today. The proposed rollback of the rule jeopardizes nearly 45 million acres of national forest, which is around a third of our national forest system. Why is this such a big deal and something that we're so incredibly worried about? Roadless areas are one of the few remaining areas in the United States where nature thrives in its own terms. They're some of the most spectacular wild places across the country. In the Pacific Northwest, they're home to stretches of our last old-growth forests and pristine streams and rivers that salmon call home. The rule was intended to preserve the last third of undeveloped forest lands across the country as a home for wildlife, a haven for recreation, and a heritage for future generations. Essentially, it was intended to keep our wild places wild. The administration is arguing that we need more roads to manage for wildfire, and that's the reason they're rescinding the rule. However, that does not hold up. The Forest Service already has a vast network of roads that they're unable to keep up with maintaining, arguing that we need to build a new road network across roadless areas when we already can't afford to maintain or decommission the ones that we already have, which is a pretty silly argument. Studies have also shown that wildfires are 4 times as likely to start in areas with roads than in roadless forest tracts. And over 90% of wildfires occur within half a mile of a road. When the rule was completed in 2001, over 1.6 million people commented, with 95% supporting the rule, more than any other federal rule in the history of our country. And more recently, over 625,000 Americans submitted public comments during the scoping comment period on the proposal to rescind the rule. And initial analysis shows that 99% of those public comments still strongly support keeping the roadless rule in place. In Oregon, the rule protects nearly 2 million acres of forest from destructive logging and development. Now, these places don't have entrance signs and they actually don't show up on many maps. But some of Oregon's most cherished wild places are in roadless areas. And I'm going to show you a couple examples before I hand it over to Lydia. All right, this is Hardesty Mountain. This is an incredible outdoor recreation area with beautiful wildflowers and incredible hikes. It's also the drinking watershed for Cottage Grove, and it's long been targeted by the logging industry because it has an incredibly an amazing assortment of mature and old growth forests that are more accessible than some other roadless areas. Lookout Mountain on the Ochiko National Forest outside of Bend. Again, some incredible alpine meadows and some massive old growth trees. It's just a beautiful area. And then Bluegrass Ridge, Mount Hood National Forest. This is pretty accessible outside of Portland, along with Larch Mountain. And these are some incredible areas to visit. And so those are some examples from Oregon, and I will hand it over to Lydia to go over some examples from Washington and then close us out for a way to get engaged.
I'm going to share a few examples from here in Washington State that illustrate why these protections matter so much. So something interesting about Washington is that old growth forests are actually underrepresented in designated wilderness areas on national forest lands. So about 94% of our wilderness areas are above 3,000 feet in high alpine environments that don't support much old growth. In contrast, our currently threatened roadless areas tend to be at lower elevations, and that's where you can find these amazing old growth forests in salmon streams. So let's start with one example, the lower Dungeness River. So this river flows through old growth forests within a threatened roadless area on the Olympic Peninsula. These forests and rivers are the lifelines for wild salmon and steelhead in the area. And then next we have the Skagit River Valley, which is surrounded by threatened roadless areas. The Skagit provides about 30% of the fresh water flowing into Puget Sound, and it's also the only river in the Puget Sound region that still supports all 5 species of wild salmon. And finally, the beloved Dark Divide. This 75,000 acre roadless area sits between Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams and holds some of the largest remaining blocks of old growth forests in Southwest Washington. Unfortunately, it was left out of the 1984 Wilderness Act, so it's protected only by administrative rule. Protecting places like these in Oregon and Washington takes all of us. And earlier this year, we saw what can happen when people speak up together. There were serious proposals in Congress to sell off public land in Utah and Nevada, about 500,000 acres or so. And Senator Mike Lee from Utah went even further, pushing to sell up to 3 million acres across the country. But that didn't happen because the public spoke up and public lands won. Woohoo! So leaders from both parties listened, and in the end, those proposals were pulled from the final budget with bipartisan support. So I really think this is a great reminder that when we come together, we can protect these places that we love. And that's the kind of momentum that we want to keep building in our organizations. So you have an opportunity right now. The next opportunity to make a difference is to speak up for the Roadless Area Conservation Act, or RACA. This bill would make roadless area protections permanent. You can scan the QR code listed here. We have Oregon residents and Washington residents on the screen. Or you can click the links in the chat to contact your members of Congress to ask them to co-sponsor the bill, or thank them if they already have co-sponsored it. And then to emphasize what Lynda said earlier, you could also write a letter with a stamp on it to your members of Congress if you're able, and you can just use these links as ideas to gather more information. So the names on this slide in particular are the representatives in Oregon and Washington who haven't yet signed on to co-sponsor the bills. So if you live in these districts, it's especially important for you to reach out. But anyway, I think that's all for me. Thank you so much for being here and for caring so much about the wild places that make this region so incredibly special.
Thanks, Lydia. Thanks, Lauren. I want to underscore what Lydia and Lauren just talked about, what Lynda talked about, and I think what a lot of questions that arose in the Q&A, which we didn't get to answer them all, which is the just critical importance of public engagement, especially at a time when democracy is under attack. Our community work that sustained and relentless engaging our elected officials to support them and to push them, it's just essential. It's the way the system has to work. It's the only way it will work, and it requires all of us and people we know that we can bring in to the conversation who aren't here tonight. So I just want to underscore that. I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank Lydia and Lauren and Oregon Wild and Washington Wild for co-hosting. I want to also thank my colleagues who are working behind the scenes, doing the magic. Abby Sachs and Martha Campos, who without whom this smooth running webinar would not occur. So huge kudos and appreciation to you all. And then thanks for all of you for attending tonight, for your interest and looking for opportunities for practicing reciprocity with each other and our home as we move forward from here. With that, before we sign off, I just want to give you a last opportunity to add or share anything, Lynda. And thank you very much for being here tonight.
So welcome. I really enjoyed it. And I only wish we could have been together personally, but then we couldn't have maybe brought in people who were with us even from Maryland and beyond. So thank you everyone for taking the time. I did answer as many of these questions as I could quickly bat out answers to. I'm happy to answer them all. Joseph, if you will get those to me, I will answer them in the days ahead. But I did notice a thread, which is what can we do? What can we do? And I would say, if there's only one thing you do, go outside, refresh your spirit, renew your heart. If you haven't been to some of these places, go there, because what you'll realize is, A, they're still here, which will buoy you for the fight ahead. But secondly, it'll help you realize that these places really are worth fighting for. And most importantly, take someone who's never been there. Take a kid, take a friend, take a neighbor. You'd be surprised how many people really haven't even seen these places for themselves. So number one, go outside and feel the wonder, and be sure to take somebody with you. I think storytelling is as old as the campfire. It is our human gift. And if you've seen these places, you can tell stories about them to someone who hasn't, including, by the way, a lawmaker. So, and don't forget the regulators, the Bureau of Land Management. They're holding the strings on all these lands up there in the Arctic, which the president wants to open to extractive mining and drilling 25 million acres up there in the Western Arctic and the National Wildlife Refuge. So I think at the heart of all this is love of place, love of home, and wanting to pass it on to future generations. So let's get out there.
Lynda, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you all for joining us. We have a lot of work to do. So let's stick together and stay in touch, and we'll see you down the road. Have a great evening, everyone. Take care.